Welcome to our deep dive into the life and legacy of Saint Sigebert, a 7th century king of Austrasia. He was also a saint.
Yeah, that's pretty unusual, isn't it? King and a saint. You don't see that very often.
Not very often at all. We have a historical biography to help us figure this out. It was written centuries later by a monk, also named Sigebert.
Oh, wow, another Sigbert. That must make things a bit confusing sometimes.
And we also have a historical notice. It helps to fill in some of the historical context.
So two Sigberts and a notice. This is going to be interesting. What's the mission for our deep dive today?
Well, we're going to try to understand how this guy managed to be both king and saint. What was his life like? What did he actually do? And how is he remembered? Oh, and there's one more interesting detail. Siegert's lineage actually connects to Charlemagne.
Wow, Charlemagne. That's a pretty big deal, especially when you think about how important Charlemagne was to European history.
Exactly. So we're talking about a king, a saint, and a connection to Charlemagne. It's quite a story, and we're going to dive right into it. Our sources start by introducing us to the Medium-Matrici people. They were an ancient tribe who had a capital city called Divodurum.
Divodurum. That's a mouthful.
I know, right? It eventually became the city we know today as Metz. Metz was Sigebert's seat of power, and it's still a major city in France.
Metz. I've always wanted to visit.
You should. It's beautiful. I wonder what it must have been like back in Sigebert's time.
Well, the historical notice actually gives us a little clue. It quotes a Roman historian named Ammianus Marcellinus.
Okay, and what does Ammianus have to say about it?
He wrote about how place names evolved over time, like how they would start out referring to a group of people, and then they would eventually become the name of a specific city.
So, Divodurum was the name of the Medium-Matrici people, and then it became the name of their city.
Exactly. It's like a snapshot of how language reflects changes in culture and politics. Speaking of changes, let's talk about the lineage of Frankish kings leading up to Sigebert.
Oh boy, here we go. It's quite a tangled web, isn't it?
It is, but it's important if we want to understand Sigbert's place in the bigger picture.
All right, let's try to untangle it. We have Clovis, who founded the Frankish kingdom, and then figures like Theodoric and Clotaire.
Right. And there were a lot of power struggles between those guys. The Merovingian dynasty was all about shifting alliances and competition for power.
So Sigebert was born into this world of constant power struggles. He was born in 586 AD. His father was King Dagobert, who was a pretty complex character.
I've heard a bit about Dagobert. Wasn't he known for being both pious and kind of, well, not so pious?
That's putting it mildly.
Mm.
The biography describes him as a very devout man early on. He was a skilled military leader, too.
What kind of military leader was he?
Well, there's this story about him defeating the Saxons so badly that he supposedly killed all the Saxon warriors who were taller than his sword.
Wow, all the warriors taller than his sword. That's quite an image.
It's a bit hard to believe, to be honest. It sounds a little exaggerated. It was probably written to emphasize Dagobert's power. But even if it's not entirely true, his military successes against the Saxons were well documented.
Yeah, makes sense. They were a constant threat on the Frankish kingdom's eastern border. So we have Dagobert, the warrior king. But what about his not-so-pious side?
Right. Well, the story takes an interesting turn. Despite his early piety, Dagobert became known for his, let's just say, his love of women.
Ah, okay, I see where this is going.
He also really wanted an heir. He was desperate for a son.
Which makes Sigebert's birth even more significant, I imagine.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. Sigebert was actually baptized by Saint Amandus.
Wait, Saint Amandus, wasn't he the guy Dagobert banished earlier?
The one and only. Dagobert actually sought forgiveness from Amandus before Sigebert was born.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful gesture. It suggests that Dagobert was really trying to turn things around, maybe seeking divine favor in the matter of having an heir.
It certainly adds a whole other dimension to Sigebert's baptism, doesn't it?
It does. It's like there's this added layer of religious significance right from the start.
And then there's the story about Sigebert as a baby miraculously saying amen during his baptism.
Seriously, a baby saying amen.
That's what the biography says. Of course, you have to wonder how much of that is true and how much is embellishment.
Yeah, it does sound a bit too good to be true.
But even if we take it with a grain of salt, it's easy to see how people would have interpreted it as a sign, like a hint of his future devotion to the church.
Right. It would have definitely contributed to the idea of Sigebert as a divinely favored ruler, right from the beginning.
So we have Sigebert, this baby, who's already being seen as something special, but things weren't all smooth sailing for him. There was a lot of political maneuvering happening around a guy named Pepin.
Pepin. What was his role in all of this?
He was the mayor of the palace. Now, that might sound like just a fancy title, but it was a very powerful position.
So he wasn't just like in charge of planning parties at the palace.
Not exactly. He was basically responsible for running the kingdom on a day-to-day basis. He had a lot of influence over the king.
Ah, okay. So Pepin was a pretty big deal. What happened to him?
Well, things got a little bit dicey at court, so Pepin decided to step back from palace life. He withdrew to protect himself and, importantly, the young Sigebert.
That's interesting. It shows just how dangerous court politics could be. Even someone as powerful as Pepin had to watch his back.
And it also shows how much he cared about Sigebert. He saw his potential even as a young boy.
So what happened when Sigurd got older? Did he live up to that potential?
He did, but he was thrown into the deep end at a very young age. When he was just 11 years old, his father decided to divide the Frankish kingdom.
Divide the kingdom. Why would he do that?
It was a common practice back then. It was supposed to prevent infighting, but it often just made things more complicated.
And where does Sigebert fit into this division?
He became the king of Austrasia. Can you imagine that? Being 11 years old and suddenly being responsible for ruling a kingdom.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure for a kid. I can't even imagine. Did he have any help?
Well, remember Grimold, Pepin's son?
Yeah, what happened to him?
He succeeded his father as mayor of the palace, so he was there to guide Sigebert. But even with Grimold's help, Sigebert faced some serious challenges early on.
What kind of challenges?
Well, there were the Wends. They were a group of Slavic tribes who posed a constant threat to the kingdom's eastern borders. And then there was a rebellion led by a guy named Duke Radolf of Thuringia.
So, external threats and internal rebellion sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It could have been, but Sigmund proved to be a capable ruler, even at such a young age. He managed to subdue his enemies and solidify his power.
That's impressive. He must have had some serious skills. And what about Grimold? What was his role in all of this?
He was a very influential figure during Sigurd's reign. They had a complex relationship, but they both seemed to understand the importance of working together.
It sounds like they needed each other to navigate those turbulent times.
Exactly. And after those early challenges, things started to settle down a bit for Sigebert. He entered a period of relative peace.
So what did he do with all that peace and quiet?
Well, he turned his attention to religion. He was known for his acts of charity and his devotion to the church.
So he was a warrior king, and now he's a pious king. Interesting combination.
He was a man of many facets. One of his most significant achievements during this time was the founding of 12 monasteries.
12 monasteries. That's a lot of monasteries.
He was very serious about his faith. And the most famous of those monasteries are Stavlot and Malmedy. They're still standing today.
Wow, that's amazing. To think that something he created is still around after all these centuries.
It's pretty remarkable. And he wasn't just content with founding them. He was incredibly generous to these monasteries. He gave them land, resources, all sorts of things.
It sounds like he was trying to use his wealth to benefit the church and secure his place in heaven.
Well, he didn't have an heir for a long time. So maybe he saw this generosity as a way to build a different kind of legacy, a spiritual one.
That's a really interesting point. It makes you wonder about his motivations. Was it purely religious devotion, or was there also a political element to it?
It was probably a combination of both, to be honest. Back then, religion and politics were very intertwined. Kingship wasn't just about earthly power. It was also about a ruler's responsibility before God.
And speaking of religious influence, Sigebert was very close with several important figures in the church, like St. Ramaclis and Cunibert, the Bishop of Cologne. They played a big role in shaping his policies.
Absolutely. Those relationships were crucial for him. And speaking of influential figures, we should talk about the monk who wrote Sigebert's biography.
Okay, what about him?
Well, he compares Sigebert to King Solomon, emphasizing how Sigebert, unlike Solomon, used his wisdom and wealth for the benefit of his soul and future generations.
That's a clever comparison. It really underscores Sigebert's piety.
And it ties into his legacy, which gets a little bit messy when we start talking about his heirs. Remember how he initially named Grimold's son, Childebert, as his heir?
Yeah, what happened with that?
Well, Sigebert eventually had a son of his own, named Dagobert. And guess what? He changed his mind and named his own son as heir instead.
Oh boy, can you imagine the drama? Grimold must have been furious.
It definitely created some tension at court, but it also shows how determined Sigebert was to assert his authority, even over someone as powerful as Grimold.
So we have Sigebert, the warrior king, the pious king, and now the king who's not afraid to make tough decisions. What a character.
He was definitely a complex figure. The monk who wrote his biography describes him as having dove-like simplicity, but also serpent-like cleverness.
That's a great description. It really captures his duality, his ability to balance piety with pragmatism.
He had to be both devout and shrewd to survive in that world. And one of the things that really stands out about him is his focus on charity. He saw it as a way to cleanse himself, to purify himself from the weight of worldly power.
There's actually a passage in the biography where the monk compares Sigbert's acts of charity to biblical teachings about almsgiving as a way to wash away sins.
It's almost like he was trying to balance out the dross of his earthly power with the refinement of spiritual devotion.
That's a really interesting way to put it. It shows how deeply intertwined religious and political thinking were back then.
And it makes you wonder how much of Siegert's piety was genuine and how much of it was politically motivated.
It was probably a bit of both. But regardless of his motivations, his actions had a profound impact on his kingdom and his legacy.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of Sigebert's reign. He died in 662 AD at the very young age of 31, after 28 years on the throne.
That's so young. What a shame. It makes you think about all the things he could have accomplished if he'd lived longer.
It's a reminder that even in the 7th century, life could be unpredictable and often cut short.
So where was he buried?
He was laid to rest in the basilica he built in Metz, dedicated to St. Martin.
That seems fitting considering his devotion to the church. It's like even in death, his faith and legacy are intertwined.
Exactly. And speaking of legacy, we've only just scratched the surface of Sigebert's story. There's so much more to explore.
There is, and it'll be fascinating to see how his story unfolds as we dive deeper into the sources.
Well, that's all the time we have for part 1 of our deep dive into the life of King and St. Sigebert. Join us next time as we delve deeper into this fascinating story. We'll be looking at his later years, his impact on the kingdom, and the lasting legacy he left behind.
You know, it's amazing to think about how we view these historical figures through our modern lens. Like with Sigebert, was he truly a pious king, or was it just, I don't know, a really clever political move?
Right. How much of it was genuine faith and how much was strategy?
Yeah, like,
Right.
was it about getting favor with the church, or was he really trying to, secure his place in heaven?
It's probably a bit of both. I mean, we can't really know for sure, but you know our source. The monk Sigebert?
Right, the other sig.
Yeah, exactly. He was writing centuries later, so his perspective is definitely shaped by his own time. I mean, he was obviously trying to portray Sigebert in a very specific light, as this ideal Christian king.
For sure. And that makes me think about something else we haven't really talked about. All those other acts of charity Sigebert did, it wasn't just the monasteries, right?
Right. He was doing all sorts of good deeds, almost like he was trying to constantly purify himself.
Yeah, exactly. Purify himself. The monk even draws those parallels to biblical passages about almsgiving as a way to wash away sin, like cleansing yourself through giving.
It's almost like a medieval version of philanthropy, isn't it? Using your wealth to do good in the world.
Yeah, and maybe trying to ease your conscience a little bit in the process. Who knows, right? But it's interesting to think about how that concept of giving back might go all the way back to figures like Sigebert.
That's a great point. It makes you realize that even though we're talking about a king from the 7th century, some of these impulses, these ideas about charity and responsibility, they still resonate with us today.
Definitely. It's like those basic human desires, they stay pretty consistent throughout history, even if the way we express them changes.
And, it makes you think about Sigebert's legacy in a broader sense, too. Not just about founding monasteries or even his connection to Charlemagne, but setting an example of how a ruler should act.
Yeah, how they should balance their power with a sense of, I don't know, spiritual responsibility. I guess that's what we might call it today.
Exactly. But that brings up another question. Beyond the religious stuff, how effective was Sigebert as an actual ruler? I mean, he did face those challenges early on. But what about the day-to-day running of his kingdom?
Yeah, good point. Did he do anything, significant, like legally?
Okay, so the sources aren't super detailed about specific laws or reforms, but they do mention Sigebert upholding existing laws and making sure justice was carried out fairly.
So more about maintaining the system that was already in place rather than creating a whole new one?
It seems like it, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. After all that instability in his early years, all those threats of division within the kingdom, stability probably felt like a top priority.
Yeah, keeping things running smoothly. Especially, since the Frankish kingdom was still pretty new at this point.
And it had just emerged from, the chaos after the Roman Empire fell. So, yeah, I can see why a strong leader who could maintain order, someone who could, uphold the law, why that would be so important.
Right, it was about survival at that point. But that makes me think about something else. We know the Franks took some inspiration from Roman laws, but they also had their own traditions. Where does Sigebert fit into all of that?
Yeah, good question. Was he trying to build on that Roman legacy, or was he creating a, like, totally separate Frankish approach?
Maybe a combination of both, like taking the best of what worked before and adapting it for the Franks.
It's fascinating to think about how those legal systems might have blended together
Hmm.
and how it would have affected people's everyday lives.
Yeah, what did it actually mean for the average person living in Austrasia? I mean, did they even notice the difference between, a Roman-influenced law versus a Frankish one?
Sadly, we can't just hop in a time machine and ask them. But maybe, I don't know, maybe by looking closer at things like land disputes or court cases,
Yeah.
or even just what kind of laws were being passed.
Right. Those little details could give us a better sense of how things worked on the ground, how justice was actually applied, and what it meant for ordinary people.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about the big names and the big events. It's also about how those things impact the daily lives of everyone else. It's about those experiences that, might not make it into the history books, but are still just as important.
Exactly. And even though our sources focus on Sigebert himself, we can use his story as a jumping-off point to explore those wider social and cultural dynamics. Like, what was it like to be a merchant or farmer or an artisan back then?
Yeah. What were their lives like? What were their hopes and dreams? Their struggles?
Right. Those are the stories that, don't always get told, but they're just as crucial for understanding the past. So it's not just about Sigebert, it's about everyone else who lived during his time.
It's about trying to capture that whole picture. Which reminds me of something else. We've talked a lot about the challenges Siegfried faced. But what about I don't know, the wins? Were there any particular achievements that stand out?
Hmm. Well, besides the military victories and, obviously his support for the monasteries, I think you could say he played a pretty key role in promoting um, cultural and intellectual life in Austrasia. Remember, monasteries weren't just religious centers, they were also places of learning and scholarship.
Right, like those medieval universities.
Exactly. And Siegert's support for those institutions helped preserve, all that classical knowledge. And it also encouraged the development of like a more distinctly Frankish art and literature.
It's amazing to think about those monks, diligently copying ancient manuscripts by candlelight. And to think that Siegbert played a part in making that possible. It's pretty incredible.
It is. And it actually connects him to the later Carolingian Renaissance. Like he helped lay the groundwork for that.
Wow. So his influence stretched further than we might think.
And that brings us back to this whole idea of legacy. It's not just about bloodlines or statues or, things like that.
It's about the impact your actions have on the world.
Exactly. Even the ones you might not have planned for. And, it makes you wonder what Sigebert would think if he could see his legacy today. How would he view the world now?
That's a great question. I mean, it's so different from the world he knew.
It really is. And, it's a good reminder that history is never really finished. It's always evolving as we ask new questions and make new connections.
And maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
by studying someone like Sigebert, we can learn something about ourselves too, about how the past informs our present, and how we might even find inspiration in the choices that people made centuries ago.
Well said. And who knows, maybe our conversation today will spark someone else's curiosity. Maybe they'll go on their own deep dive into this fascinating period in history.
That's the best part, isn't it? There's always something new to discover, another story to uncover.
Exactly. History is a never-ending journey.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the life of Saint Sigebert. We've talked about his baptism, his rise to power, his devotion to the church. But like all stories, this one has an ending. And Sigebert's comes pretty early. He died in 662 AD when he was only 31.
31. Wow, that's young. Especially when you consider how much he did in those 31 years.
Right. It kind of makes you wonder what else he might have accomplished if he had, lived a little longer.
Yeah, what if? But I guess that's a question for another time. For now, let's focus on how Sigbert's story actually ends. What were those final years like?
Okay, so if you remember from last time, Sigebert decided to name his own son as his heir instead of Grimoald's son. And, well, that created a lot of tension at court.
Oh, yeah, I bet it did. Grimoald must have been fuming.
It definitely caused some problems. And ultimately, it led to Sigbert's downfall. He was betrayed and assassinated by Grimoald's supporters.
Assassinated. Wow, I didn't see that coming. It's hard to believe that a king, especially one known for his piety, could be caught up in that kind of violence.
It's a reminder that even in the 7th century, palace intrigue was a dangerous game, and no one, not even a king, was immune to it.
It makes you think about the whole Merovingian dynasty. They were constantly dealing with internal conflicts, power struggles. It's like it was built into their system.
It's almost as if Sigbert's life reflects the dynasty itself, a promising beginning followed by, conflict and eventually a tragic ending.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture. But Sigbert's story didn't end there, right? I mean, he still left behind a legacy.
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget about all those monasteries he founded. Many of them, like Stavlot and Malmedy, they thrived long after his death. They became important centers of learning and cultural exchange.
Right, and they played a crucial role in preserving knowledge during the early Middle Ages.
Exactly. And let's not forget Sigbert's connection to Charlemagne. His niece, Bega, was Charlemagne's grandmother. So there's a direct link there.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive family tree. It really emphasizes Sigebert's influence, even beyond his own lifetime.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into St. Sigebert's life, what are the key takeaways? What have we learned from this king, who was also a saint, this ruler who tried to balance power and piety?
Well, I think one big takeaway is that, even figures from the distant past can teach us a lot about leadership, about the relationship between politics and religion, and about the importance of legacy.
I agree. And Sigebert's story also reminds us that history is about real people, not just names and dates in a textbook.
They had their own hopes, their own ambitions, their own flaws, just like us.
Exactly. And their choices, those choices had consequences that continue to shape our world today. So to our listener, we encourage you to keep exploring history, keep questioning, keep digging deeper, because you never know what you might find.
There's always something new to learn, another story to uncover, and maybe, just maybe, by understanding the past, we can get a little closer to understanding ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the life of St. Sigebert. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another journey into the past.